everyone, and welcome back to another episode of History of Horror. This is a series on my channel where I talk about classic horror movie monsters and how they have evolved through film and television over time, all while turning myself into one of these monsters with makeup. So last week I talked about vampires and you guys really seemed to like that video, so I am back with a second one, and today we are going to be talking about one of the most underrated movie monsters in my opinion, but one that also has the most movies out like in the ether, and that is mummies. So through my research, I found there are three key elements to mummy movies that make them completely different from any other monster in the genre. One of them being that there is a very weak literary background when it comes to mummies. Bram Stoker has written quite a few mummy books, or one large one that just for some reason is the only one that people reference, but there's no long literary history like with Dracula and werewolves and other kind of monsters. The other thing is, mummies are very rarely pretty. They are not sexy. They are not meant to be a love interest. They are just meant to be scary monsters that are discovered through some sort of archaeological dig. And the third thing is, mummies are real. They're not fake monsters that people have had to make up. We know mummies are real, that they exist. They're in Egypt. They're in tombs. They are a real thing, but they are so far removed from Hollywood and Western culture that it's really easy to turn them into monsters or under a curse or are some sort of living dead sort of thing. Mummies are actually one of the oldest movie monsters ever to exist. The first known mummy movie came out in 1899 and was a silent film that featured a mummy that I believe came back to life. It was reanimated, and that is a trope that you will see a lot through these mummy films. The first iteration that we have of a movie called Just the Mummy came out in 1911, which was about a wealthy man trying to impress a woman and make him seem well-traveled and very smart. So he buys a mummy at auction, and when he brings it into his home, it comes back to life. Then we have the second iteration of The Mummy, which came out in 1932, and this one was produced by Universal Studios, which I told you guys we will talk about a lot in this series because Universal Studios is basically the authority on horror movies. They produce a ton of the horror movies that we have today. Other than Blumhouse, we really don't see a lot of other studios taking on horror films, so you're going to hear about Universal quite a bit. So in the 1932 movie, the mummy again comes back to life after being discovered on an archaeological dig, and his purpose is to find the lost love that he had when he was alive, that he believes is now reincarnated in a young woman in the film. After the 30s, mummy movies kind of delved into comedy. They kind of left horror and they weren't supposed to be scary anymore. It was more about a lot of misfits finding mummies and them being chased by them in kind of a Scooby-Doo-esque comedy style. But after a while, they eventually came back into the horror genre. Unlike vampire movies, mummy movies didn't have one particular niche or subgenre that defined the eras between the 1930s and 1959. They were all basically kind of the same tropes, the same ideas. Someone goes on an archaeological dig in search of this mummy, they find it, the mummy's cursed or was never really dead kind of thing. They come back to life, they chase them. It's their job to either make the curse go away or get the mummy back in the tomb so then they die again, all those kind of things. So all of these movies were kind of in the same arc, and there was no real evolution for a really long time. Now, I know in the introduction I said that there are a lot of mummy movies out there, and there absolutely is, but between 1959 and 1964, there are actually no mummy movies on record of being produced or released. Now, they may have been being made, but they never made it to theaters, whether that be on foreign or U.S. soil. But in 1964, mummy movies came back. Most of them were sequels to movies that already existed in the 50s, were erotic horror films that were kind of new to the genre and very with the times, I would say, because the 60s, we all know, was kind of a wild time. So it was drawing from what was going on in the real world and throwing it into horror movies, or they were completely animated. Some Scooby-Doo movies came out then, and there were some stop motion animation things going on at that time as well. Now, in 1971, one of the most essential, well-known, kind of defining the genre movies came out, and that was Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. This was an adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, and this is where we kind of see the first hot lady mummy. From pictures that I saw from the movie, it is a scantily clad dressed woman. She is not wrapped up in any sort of gauze or, stereotypical mummy dress that we would think of. She's draped in jewels, and she doesn't have a whole lot covering her. It still uses the trope of people going and looking for treasure or being on an archaeological dig. Then in 1980, The Awakening came out, and it was another adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel. And then in 1987, we have Monster Squad. Now, this movie really isn't horror, but I thought it was important to talk about in this series since I'm talking about all the monsters that are in this movie. It was they called it one epic teen horror movie, and this is the only thing I saw that they considered a teen horror movie that had mummies in it. For some reason, teenagers and mummies do not cross paths. And I'm thinking most of that is because of the archaeological dig aspect. There's not really going to be high schoolers searching for treasure in Egyptian tombs. So Monster Squad is very campy and more kind of cheesy horror, not something that really was meant to scare you like the movies of the 30s and 40s. And most of the horror from the movies in the 30s and 40s came from the unknown aspect. You have to remember back then, people weren't traveling as much. Americans didn't really know a whole lot about Egypt. It was all very new. These tombs were just being opened for the first time. They were just being discovered. A lot of things hadn't even been pulled out of these tombs yet. They just knew that the pyramids existed. So a lot of this comes from that fear of the unknown element, and that's where we get so much of our mummies, because a lot of it comes from religion too. In the West, we really don't practice mummification. So any kind of time that the dead are treated differently than, say, what Hollywood considers the norm, you can make a horror movie out of it, and it'll probably do very well because people are just uneducated on these topics, and being uneducated can lead to fear. So now we have to talk about one of the biggest, most important mummy movies of all time, and that is The Mummy from 1999. This movie sparked so many spin-offs, so many sequels, it was huge to the genre of the time. So this was a remake of the 1932 Universal picture, and it was made by Universal. It was an adventure-based movie rather than being just horror-based, so a lot more focused on them getting there, them getting out, but there was still that scare element that came with it. This movie actually created a new template for what mummy movies became. There was a comedy element, there was a historical element, and then there was sort of this fantastical, magical, Indiana Jones-esque story that came with it, and it was mildly scary. You're getting a lot more jump scares or creepy, spooky kind of vibes rather than outright horror and gore kind of situations. This actually is the highest grossing mummy movie of all time, and there's even a ride dedicated to it in Universal Studios, and I have to say it's one of the best rides in the park, and it actually is kind of scary. So I think they did a really good job of portraying the parts of the movie that made it such a big box office hit and putting it into the ride, but that's a different talk for a different day. Because of The Mummy's success, obviously there was a sequel. In 2001, they made The Mummy Returns, which did very well in the box office as well. But it also started The Rock's career in acting, because the Scorpion King is part of the Mummy universe. So you can thank The Mummy for that. Then in 2008, the third movie in the trilogy came out, and it was The Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. Now, I don't remember this movie coming out in 2008. I feel like I definitely remember the other two movies, but I do not remember this one at all. I don't really know what it's about, but I know it strayed away from Egypt and focused more on Chinese mummification. And then in 2007, we had the Tom Cruise The Mummy reboot. And I really don't understand why this movie was ever made, and I'm not trying to be super critical of this movie because I haven't seen it. All I know is that it bombed. and I did not see the point in remaking this movie. The original trilogy did such a good job of, you know, portraying mummies and having that adventure sense that I don't think we really needed it to be remade, but Hollywood loves to do remakes and reboots. So it actually did so bad in the box office that they canceled all future movies in this universe. There was supposed to be a whole dark universe take on the Mummy. I did so bad, people said, no, I will not go see any of these movies, and they decided to cancel them altogether. So I know I went through a lot of information very, very quickly, so if you have any questions, leave them down below. But to sum it all up, Mummy movies have been around for a very, very long time, and there are so many out there that I think just about anybody can find one that they like, whether it's Scooby-Doo movies, whether it's Laurel and Hardy, whether it's an actual scary classic of the original Mummy from 1932, you can probably find one that you like. And sadly, there's been very little evolution in this genre, but I also think there is only so much evolution you can do while remaining fictional or historically accurate and staying true to what people want out of a good Mummy movie. So they're really, and also vampires had a good stint on TV. Mummies haven't really had a series on TV, and I did not find any that are in the works either. I guess mummies are just meant for the big screen. So if you're going to see a Mummy movie, you will probably see a mummy coming back to life to fulfill a prophecy or be rid of a curse or find a lost love. You might see some erotic horror. You're probably going to get some comedy because there's always comedy in Mummy movies, or you might find a combination of all of these things. So thank you guys for watching History of Horror. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one just as much as you enjoyed the vampire one. The next one coming up, we are going to be talking about werewolves, which I am super excited for because I am a werewolf girl. That is my horror creature of choice. So I will see you guys in the next one. Make sure you subscribe and check out my first episode about vampires down below. Bye.